Hello there, fellow interviewers. Welcome to the Art of the Interview. My name is Will Bowman, your host. Thank you for tuning in to yet another episode. If this is your first listen, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you here. This show is about how to be a better interview, how to ask better questions so that you can get better answers. And it's not just about official professional interviewing, it's also about just the art of asking questions so you can be a better interviewer, a better friend, a better family member, a better spouse, and pretty much anything that requires you to ask questions in any context in your life. So thanks for tuning in. It's been a bit since the last episode, probably about a month or two. And that's really on my plate. The reason for that was that I went to St. Louis for a film production trip a couple months ago, and that just really put me super far behind on my schedule with client and fulfillment work. And as often happens when you get behind on fulfillment work, you really just get behind on your marketing, especially with a small team like we have. Pretty much I do quite a bit of the heavy lifting. I have a few dedicated contractors, but most of it falls on my shoulders. And at the end of the day, it's hard to justify, sitting down to record this when you have everyone's waiting for their media. But I have successfully dug myself at least to a moderately, sort of even keel point with that work. And I've been really thinking about some different episodes that I wanted to record for this. I actually have three ideas, two of them outlined for this content, and I'm really super excited to be sitting here today and recording an episode for you because I think this is some super valuable content that we're going to be covering today. I would say this is probably some of the most valuable content that I could provide. And the reason is not a lot of interviewers are teaching this because it's not the fun, juicy stuff. It's actually a little bit more behind the scenes, but how you frame your interview, which is what we're talking about today, is directly correlated with the quality of the interview on all levels, not just on the, quality of the conversation, which is definitely a big part of it is contingent on this, but also the quality of your video, your audio. So much of the quality of your interview, from the content all the way down to the technical aspects, is related to how you frame your interview, and that's what you do to create structure around your interview for optimal results. And that's what I'm going to be talking about here today. So without further ado, or apologies for being late and truant with my episode recording, let's jump in and talk about how to frame your interview. So in this episode, I'm going to talk to you about 3 ways that I personally frame my interview, and that's 1, in the emails that I send before the interview, 2, on the actual interview, and 3, after the interview. I have very specific processes and ways that I frame the interview at every single one of those steps that I believe makes the quality of the interview actually better than it would have been if I hadn't actually done that. So we're going to cover each of them. So the first one I want to talk about is in the email that I send before the interview. And I guess I should say the emails, because generally I send a series of emails, which includes the initial reach out email all the way to the email that is providing them with the framing for the actual interview once they've agreed to do it. Now, I'm not in this episode going to go into what exactly I say to ask people about the interview and to get them to say yes. That's maybe a content for another episode. In this interview, I'm just going to focus on that framing interview, or that framing email that I send right before the interview to sort of set the tone, establish expectations, make requests of them. What do I say in that interview so that I can prime them both as an interviewee and also to get the best quality video and audio out of the interview that I'm doing, whether or not that's in person, that I'm doing live, right? Or whether or not I'm doing it online, if I'm doing a virtual interview with them. So what do I say in that? So in the email, I'm just going to list this out for you, and I'm going to go over what I say and why I say it. We're just going to go point by point. We're going to go quickly through them so I don't keep you here for an hour because there's a lot, right? So first of all, in the email, I talk about the specific time and location for the interview. I reiterate it. Maybe we've already said it, but I reiterate it. This is when we're doing it. This is where it's happening, because so often those kinds of things get lost. And I want to make sure everything is included in that email so that they know exactly when and where they need to be for that interview. Clear communication creates safety for an interviewee who otherwise is probably going to be nervous about the interview that they're going to be doing. So I also talk about how to get the best sound and lighting. I'm going to give you some very specifics about this in that interview. I talk about phone versus computer recording if I'm doing it digitally, right? So if I'm doing it on their iPhone or if their computer. I make some online studio technical requests, and I want to reassure them of a couple things to create that safety. So very specifically, what I say in that email, let's just go through it point by point. As for logistics, we will send you the link to join the studio 10 to 15 minutes before the interview. I just want to set the tone. If we're doing this digitally or virtually, this is where you get that access link, because I can't count the amount of times that in the past before I started doing this, people were like, when am I getting the link? Where is it going? How's it going? That kind of lack of clarity causes technical issues, which can reduce the quality of the interview. Next, I say the interview itself will likely go 30 to 40 minutes, though there may be a few minutes of prep before we get started. I want to create realistic expectations. This isn't going to be a 15-minute ordeal. This could take some time, and I want to just set expectations that we could be there for a little while. Next, I say everything we record is completely editable, so there's plenty of room to redo things and experiment. This is huge for people who are coming on to do the interview who are nervous about doing interviews. If they get a reassurance in the email that everything is editable and everything is changeable, that's going to go a really long way to setting them at ease. Okay, this is not something which is going to be live. This is not something which is going to be set in stone. This can be edited, and that's going to put their mind at ease and let them focus on the content of the interview, which is the most important thing for them to be focusing on, not stressing out about whether or not they're going to be able to cut out that bad flub that they have 30 minutes into the interview. We want them to know exactly, yes, they can. Next, I say, here are a few requests so we can capture the best quality interview possible. Please pick a room or space with lots of light, particularly on you, the subject. Consistent natural light works well, as do rooms well lit with artificial light. Here I'm giving some really specific requests for lighting, and most of the time people really go a long way to respect that, right? So this actually can significantly change and up-level the quality of your interview, especially when you're doing it online, on Zoom, on Riverside, on Podcastle, whatever tool that you're using. You want to make sure that they are in the best light possible. In the same vein, I also say, please pick a room or space without any background noise, heaters, washing machines, running water, open windows, so we can get clean, crisp sound. Again, you just want to presence your requests so that whether or not they're picking a location for where you're going to do the actual interview live in person, or whether or not they're picking a room where they're going to do the virtual interview, they can be mindful of things like refrigerators or water or fans, right? So often people won't think about this stuff unless you ask them. And the last thing you want to do is show up on set and to have a really obnoxious audio in the background that you have to take out and post later, or that you ultimately can't and you have really low quality audio. Asking them about it, they will think about it, and generally the quality of what they do is pretty good. Next, I say, if you have either a microphone or headphones with a microphone, please use those. Again, generally people, if they're doing stuff, and this is specifically for if you're doing it online, if you're doing an online interview, you want to ask them to get a microphone that's going to get the best quality sound. Next, I talk about our online studio. I use a tool called riverside.fm for recording online interviews, and I have some very specific requests related to that platform. It's an awesome platform because it allows you to record high quality raw audio and video of both your participants, so the interviewer, the interviewee, so that you as the editor, if you're doing, if you're also editing your podcast, or whoever is doing that, if you're doing podcasts or interviews or whatever, they have those raw files so that they can give you the best quality product. And I always ask my interviewees to have some specific context for using that platform. For example, our online studio only supports Chrome and Edge browsers. Please download one of these, update it to the most recent version, and join the call from there. If you're using a phone for recording, please stabilize the shot with a tripod and plug in your phone for interview. Our online studio requires you to download Riverside.fm app on your phone, so please go download it together for our time together, or the link we send will prompt you to do so. And the last thing, I'll just lump this under here, is if you are using a webcam for recording, please update your drivers and set the camera to capture the highest resolution video that's possible. So you'll notice that there's a lot of technical stuff here. And it seems a little weird that maybe I'd be so focused on this stuff, but let me tell you, as someone who has done a lot of online videos, as an interviewer, if I can deal with all these technical snafus before the interviewee shows up, that is going to go a long way to creating safety and clarity and continuity and comfort when they show up online for the actual interview. There is nothing that sucks the fun out of a room like having to deal with technical problems before an interview. I've been that guy. I know I have to deal with it, right? And it puts everybody on edge, especially if you're doing a virtual interview. You want to make things as clean and smooth for the person who's on the other side of that as you possibly can. And framing the interview up front and giving them these requests goes a huge, long way to being able to do that. You're not being manipulative. You're not being controlling. What you're being is respectful of their time so that they can get in there, deal with the stuff beforehand, so that when they show up on the day for that interview, they're ready to go and you're ready to go for the best possible interview. So that's really the email that I send out, a really good summary of the things that I send out before the actual interview and say, this is what I'm asking. Normally I give them, a couple days, a week to try and do all of this stuff. And generally people are pretty respectful and do quite a good job. You would be amazed at the difference with the quality of the results that I get from sending this to, from when I used to not send this to actually sending it now. The quality goes significantly up when people actually have this as a checklist. And it actually also goes a long way to setting them at ease because oh, I know exactly what I need to do and here's how I do it, right? Sometimes your interviewees will need a little bit of support, like with updating drivers, those kinds of things, right? It's generally good to have a technical person who can help them with that, especially if they're doing, online interviews or whatever. That could be you. Maybe that's not you. I don't know. But giving them these technical requests, whatever those technical requests are, goes a long way to making for a smooth run on the day that you show up to do the interview. Okay, so next I want to talk about during the call before the interview. I also, once I've done that, so the day has come, you've done your hair, you've done your makeup, you are dressed nicely for the interview, you've got your questions, you've put your game face on, you are ready to go. How do you frame the interview right before you start? You've hit the record button, you're ready to go. Let's frame this interview to make the best possible quality interview that you're going to be able to get. So the first thing that I always do right before the interview is I thank the person. And I genuinely thank them. I really try to genuinely thank them because what they're doing is scary. What they're doing is difficult. It takes a lot of courage to be able to show up and to do an interview, to share from your sense of self, from your passions, your hopes, your dreams, maybe some darker areas of your life. I always like to thank people for doing it from really the core of who I am and my heart, for being willing to do this with me, because it's not easy. And I'll be honest with you, it relaxes them and it makes them feel appreciated. There's definitely ulterior motives, but I genuinely mean it, because I also understand how difficult it can be to be interviewed, and I want to make sure they understand that. So I always just say thank you for being willing to share your story. I'm honored to be able to hear and share your story. People's stories are very important to them, so thank them for it. And then I say a couple things before we start. We have a list of questions, but we also may go deeper into something you say at any given moment. I want to normalize how I'm going to do this interview. I want to normalize the fact that I have questions, but I also may decide to kind of follow the energy and go someplace if I feel like that's where I'm going to go. If you want to know what I mean by follow the energy, there's another episode earlier in the podcast where I talk about how to follow the energy of an interview wherever it's going to lead. And I want to normalize that and presence that before I actually start the interview so they understand, we might go and do a little bit of exploration. I also say we may ask you to repeat, reword, or rephrase something that you say during the interview so that we can get another take, a more succinct take, or summarize something. A lot of times toward the end of the interview, I go back and I try and coach them a little bit and say, okay, let's try to talk about this, but let's say it a little differently. This might be if I was recording like a testimonial interview, or if I was interviewing for a sales video or some sort of commercial project. Obviously, if I'm doing a vodcast or like a podcast, I'm probably not going to be doing this, but I always like to presence it, right? So that they're aware of it and they don't feel manipulated. So they're like, okay, that might happen at some point, right? Generally, I wait till the end of the interview to do this, because when you're doing that kind of coaching and directing, there's a different part of their brain that gets engaged. I've tried to do this in the middle of the interview, and every time I can tell what they do is they shift from just talking from their heart into trying to say what they think I want to hear, which is okay, but you don't want them to be at that point in the middle of the interview. You want them to be at that point at the end, once you've gone through all the good stuff, and then maybe you're trying to refine things, right? Get a shorter take. But I always talk about that at the beginning, in the middle, or in the beginning, so that they understand it might happen at some point and they don't feel bad. I also say this is all editable, reaffirming that. So if you want to retry or remove something, that's totally okay. Treat this like a conversation, not as an official interview. Your whole goal as an interviewer is to get the person out of the being interviewed mindset and back into a place of speaking from their heart, from their place of just talking. There's something that shifts in most of our brains when we're being interviewed, away from just talking like a normal human into, I'm now going to talk like I feel like I should talk. I'm going to be profound, and I'm going to be this way. And now I'm frozen because I'm talking from this place of stilted guy. You don't want your interviewee to be in that place. And if you tell them this is all editable, treat it like a conversation, not like an official interview, they're going to be so much more relaxed. And they're going to be free to make a mistake and say something that maybe they don't want to get used, right? That's the place you want them in. Not, I need to say everything perfectly the first time, or else all of this is going to be used against me in a court of law. That's not what you're doing, right? So I reaffirm that again at the beginning of the interview. And I also say, if you have questions or need clarity at any point, feel free to ask. You want to give them freedom to ask you questions related to what you're asking them. You want them to be able to engage back. If they don't understand something, if that's confusing, if they don't really want to answer a question or they need clarity somewhere, you want them to feel free to dialogue with you about that. So I always open up the conversation and say, hey, if you have these questions or you need clarity, just ask me. Again, we're having a conversation. This is not me asking you questions, only answer me in the way that you think I want to hear. That is not what we want to do. So that's how I frame the interview. And then I jump right in and I start asking questions and I do all the things that I just said that I'm going to do. Again, topics for different podcast episodes. So that's what I do before the actual interview proper. Finally, I complete the interview. I say, thank you so much. We all go our separate ways. What now? Do we just leave it hanging? Do we just leave the interviewee out there to be like, wow, that was a great experience, or oh, that was a terrible experience, or whatever, to just stew and never hear from us again? No, we don't do that. What I have learned to do is to do a little bit of framing after the interview as well. And this serves multiple purposes. One, it reconnects and continues the conversation, relaxes the person so that there's a little bit of a transition out of communication with them. And it also serves some very practical purposes to set expectations for the person about the interview that they just did. So I'm going to talk just briefly about what I do and what I say in that follow-up email. So again, the first thing I do is always thank them. What they did, generally they have a good time. Like I oftentimes do end interviews and people are like, wow, that was a lot more relaxed and fun and exciting than I thought that it was going to be. But whether or not they had a good time or it was really hard for them, you want to thank them for their time. They gave you time, largely probably not paid, so you want to thank them. Next, I say it could take up to a month or more to process your interview. I want to set expectations. This isn't going to be a turnover thing. Like, it's not going to take a couple days. It could take a while. And this is really important because a lot of times interviewees, they want to use their interview for their own purposes. And a lot of clients and customers will allow them to do that. You just want to set the expectation. Look, this could take a while to process this. Sometimes the customer will want the raw interview, and generally you can provide that to them. But if they want something polished or they want to look at the polish, it could take a while. So I like to just set that expectation of like, hey, this could take a bit. Next, I also open up if they want to talk to me about the interview. I say, if you have any questions or on how your interview is edited, please email me directly. A lot of times clients can get a little bit of cold feet. They can kind of like, oh, I don't know how this is going to be used, yada, yada, yada. I want them to feel open to email me and ask me about that. And finally, I say, is there any capacity you would like us to not use your interview? This is important for especially my commercial interviews and interviewees for marketing. Generally speaking, there's normally an expectation when we do those kinds of things that we are going to be using this as a marketing email. But like if I am doing this, for example, for a podcast, right? I want to make sure that I don't get myself or my clients in any sort of trouble by using the interview in a way that they're not comfortable with. So I just put it right in there. Is there any way you don't want us to use your interview? I can tell you, I have never ever had someone say, I don't want it used here or here. But again, it's about giving them agency and making them feel comfortable that they are in control of this as well, and that we're not just going to take their interview and use it willy-nilly without their permission. This is their image, their thoughts, their feelings, their identities. It's very important that they have a say in how it gets used in the end. But again, most people, if they've gotten to this point, are going to be pretty open for being used in whatever capacity, right? The only context that maybe they might not want it used is maybe they don't want to use it in social media, which, oftentimes is not really what our clients are wanting to use it for anyways, right? But it's just good to have that. So that's what I say in my follow-up email. Now I want to say these are organic processes, emails that I'm constantly updating. I can't tell you exactly how many of these I've added in the last year because these are growing. As I discover new ways of framing these interviews, I add things. Sometimes I shift how they're worded because my goal is really to just make this as easeful and relaxing of a process as humanly possible for people. So whatever I'm doing, take it and adapt it to your needs. Are you doing mostly in-person interviews? You're not necessarily going to need to talk about your online platforms and whether or not to use a phone or a computer for your interview. Take these and adapt them. What do your clients need to hear to relax them and to set them up for success during the interview? That's really what you want to do and you want to think about when you're talking about framing this interview. Your goal is to give them as great of an experience as possible. And if you do that, they're going to reciprocate that. They're going to want to give you a good experience of telling their story and sharing their story because that's how human beings work. It's called the principle of reciprocity. When you genuinely, from a place of wanting their best, give them good things and look out for them, they're going to sense that and they're going to want to give you as good of a possible performance as they possibly can. So that is how to frame your interviews. I have linked all of my emails that I use and my questions and framing lists in the show notes for this episode. You are welcome to take them, steal them, and adapt them to your needs. My goal is better interviews for everyone, so you don't need to cite me, you don't need to do anything like that. Just take it, adapt it, use the verbiage, or reword it as you feel comfortable. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I really appreciate your time and your listenership and your desire to be as good of a possible interviewer as you can. Thank you so much. Click below, subscribe to this podcast if you're someone who, like me, really wants to ask as good a questions as you possibly can, whether you're doing marketing interviews, podcasts, or just having a conversation with a friend over coffee. This is the podcast for you. Like the page, subscribe to the podcast, and continue to get these episodes. I hope you find them value. We'll see you next time on The Art of the Interview.